William Bratton, we've seen a rebirth of New York in recent years, where crime rates, homicide has plummeted less than half of what it was at the start of the decade. As a former police commissioner in New York, you've been given credit for a lot of these changes. What is it basically that you've done to that city?
There are two things at work there. Politically, there was political authorization for the police to take back streets that had been given up for 25 years in New York City and other American cities. Mayor Giuliani was elected on a crime reduction platform. He then authorized the police to begin to enforce rules, regulations, and laws that for 25 years they had been discouraged from enforcing. And we had a very large police force, and we were able to very quickly, with 38,000 police, make a difference in the streets of New York.
When most people think of crime and eradicating or reducing crime, they think of focusing on the big issues, the big problems. Your campaign of zero tolerance was quite different. Give us some examples of where you started.
Well, first off, zero tolerance is not what we did in New York City. I don't use that term other than for police corruption and police use of drugs. So that's a misnomer that we don't practice zero tolerance, because it implies that there are no exceptions. Well, what we're all about in New York City is empowering the police to exercise discretion in dealing with different issues. So I'm glad you raised that so I could provide that explanation. What we did in New York City was quite simply focus on 7 or 8 major crime areas that were generating fear in New York City. One of those areas was quality of life, the so-called broken windows types of crime, aggressive begging, graffiti, loud parties, prostitution, use of drugs on the street, smoking marijuana, etc. But what needs to be understood that that's too simplistic an explanation of what happened in New York City. That was one of 8 strategies: drugs, guns, auto theft, police corruption, quality of life, youth crime, that were employed to reduce crime, fear, and disorder all at the same time, everywhere in the city.
That when we talk about quality of life crimes, I mean, they're often referred to as victimless
That's
crimes,
right. And they are
prostitution.
not.
And the tendency has been to kind of turn a blind eye.
That's correct.
That while there were many other different components, it strikes me that this was a very important part of the general effort, getting rid of these quality of life crimes.
One of the things that we learned in America over the last 25 years is that these so-called victimless crimes were anything but. They destroyed neighborhoods. The prostitute working on the corner, sure, her and the John engaged in an exchange of money for sex. Victimless. Who's harmed? The neighborhood was harmed. You didn't want that occurring on your doorstep. You didn't want to come out in the morning and step all over condoms or be up all night listening to the exchange of negotiations. So many of the so-called victimless crimes might have been victimless in the sense of the 2 people engaged in it. But what about the neighborhood? What about society? Society was victimized, and it took us 25 years to realize that.
And that also that it creates an environment of lawlessness that
Exactly.
encourages. That it's really interesting going through the research to find out that this broken windows theory, I mean, in fact, goes back almost 15 years. This is an important part.
It goes back to, I in 1977 was a sergeant in charge of a neighborhood policing program, which was the precursor of community policing in one of the worst neighborhoods of Boston. People in that neighborhood, a high crime neighborhood, when they came to my community meetings, wanted to talk not about that serious crime, because very few of them had actually been victimized by it, a lot more aware of it because of the press, but what all of them wanted to talk about was conditions in their streets, the prostitutes, the gangs drinking at night, the abandoned cars, the graffiti. Why don't you, the police, do something about that? We, the police, were surprised that, well, we thought our role was to deal with serious crime, because society was telling us, don't pay attention to little things. Little things don't count. Why should you be concerned with prostitution or minor drug dealing or somebody smoking marijuana with a gang in the corner? Why? Because society was being victimized, and we were losing street after street, neighborhood after neighborhood. And what we've come to understand is those environments were our learning environments for our young people. And so we developed 2 generations of Americans, young people, who grew up in a society where anything goes. And as a result, they were resistant to obeying the rules.
Explain to our listeners, I think it's very important, how a single broken window in a building can lead to larger crime.
Let me give you an example from my transit experience. I was chief of the subway police in New York City.
Before you became commissioner.
And subways in New York, as in Toronto, are the lifeblood of that city. 3.5 million people a day use them. In 1990, the issue of fare evasion, not paying your fare, had become epidemic. Why?
Third of a million people a day.
250,000 people a day, a loss of $90 million a year in revenue. It started small, begins to grow. People look around and say, why should I pay my fare? Nobody else is paying the fare. When we began the campaign of correcting that, and to correct it, we had to make arrests. It had become that bad. We found that 1 out of every 7 people we were arresting were wanted on a warrant for another offense for which they had failed to go to court. Why? Because nobody was looking for them. 1 out of every 21 was carrying some type of weapon, ranging from knives on up to machine guns. And they were going to use that for protection or to commit other crimes. Now, in 1997, after years of enforcement, on an average day, there's 25,000 incidents. We used the police to control behaviors to such an extent we changed it. Now, 1 out of about 100 is wanted on a warrant, and now 1 out of hundreds is found to be carrying a weapon. People understand if you go into the subways in New York and evade the fare, 1, you can stand a good chance of being arrested, and 2, you better not be wanted on a warrant and better not be carrying a weapon because you're going to stand a good chance of being arrested. That's what it's all about. By dealing with little things, we impacted on the big things. Coincidentally, we had strategies to deal with the other crimes of robbery and burglary on the system. Those plummeted because a lot of the people who felt free to come in and do whatever they wanted on the system now understood this was a system under control.
For years and years, police' main job was to react to crime.
That was
a
the
crime
policing
occurred,
strategy.
And it would be fun if you were a policeman. Way more fun to solve crimes.
It was fun to go running around in your police cars, better that than walking a beat. It was sexier, and it was the thing to do. And that's what society expected of the police, because society...
How did you change that psychology with the guys on the beat?
First off, I changed. I came to understand as a young police officer, I had my share of car chases. I didn't want to walk a beat. I wanted to be riding around. But as a supervisor, I came to understand that that was only part of the business. And also, as I became better educated and was exposed to more and more of the thinking that was beginning to emerge, George Kelling, Jim Wilson, the authors of Broken Windows, came to understand that the reacting role was too limiting for police, that police can be expected to reduce crime, control behavior. Not enough was expected of us because society was wrongfully believing that crime was caused by societal issues, racism, the economy. I'm sorry, I don't believe that. I think it's just the reverse. I think those conditions are worsened by crime. And police can do something about crime, and by doing something about crime and disorder, we in fact improve society. But the issue of reacting to crime rather than proactively going at it, how do you encourage cops to do that? Think about the fare evasion issue. Cops didn't like dealing with it. Oh, we want a $1.15 theft of service, we're going to be tied up with this character. Well, like a Cracker Jack box, you know, as a kid you'd reach into that box of caramelized popcorn and you get the prize. Well, when you arrested somebody for fare evasion, under our laws, you could question them, you could check them out for warrants, you could pat them down for weapons. And in the early days, it was like shooting ducks in a barrel because 1 out of 7 was wanted on a warrant, oftentimes a murder warrant, 1 out of 21 carrying a weapon. The cops got into it because they saw it as not only dealing with minor crime that they got a lot of credit for, but they saw it as dealing with serious crime. And what we also benefited from, the public saw the police for the first time in 25 years acting upon things that generated fear or anger on them. For 25 years, the police would ride by this or pay no attention to it. And the public say, why don't you do something? Well, the reason we don't do anything, we're not authorized. The politicians, the managers of the Transit Authority say, don't pay attention to that. Focus on the serious crime.
Well, I want to go back to something you touched upon, because your approach really is very contrary to our traditional understanding of what causes crime. You see a homeless person, you say, well, the system has failed this individual. So if we want to solve this problem, we have to solve the systemic problems. Now, you're saying something quite different, that homeless person, or an aggressive, begging homeless person.
Right. The status of being homeless is a societal issue. But the behavior can become a police issue when that behavior is in violation of laws that are established for everybody, no matter what your status, rich or poor, white or black, employed or unemployed. And it's exacerbated, understandably, by a large element of our homeless population in the United States were the result of awful policies in the 1970s in which we were well-intended going to break up our major mental institutions and put people in neighborhood facilities. Problem along the way, hundreds of thousands of those people never made it. Society said, well, we tried, and just think of all the money we're saving. What money did we save? We literally put these poor souls into the streets and the subways and literally then neglected them. Well, we've come to understand that that was very short-sighted, at least in America, and I understand that might be a situation that's going on up here. And if you're going in that direction, God help you, because you're going to repeat the mistakes of America 20 years ago, and you're going to see the same results.
Now, by cleaning up people who might be smoking pot in the street or peeing in the corners or sleeping on the subway bench, what happens to these people?
You change their behavior. You admonish them, you summons them, you arrest them. And that's why the zero tolerance is a misnomer, because we give police various tools to deal with various situations. It's not a matter that you'll arrest everybody or you'll summons everybody. A very simple tool we used in the subway was to eject them out of the system onto the streets. Then you might argue, well, doesn't the street have the problem? It certainly does, but in 1994, with the election of Mayor Giuliani, then the city police began to, similar to the subway police, begin to enforce the rules. So we provided a citywide control of behavior. So the person that's casually standing on the corner smoking marijuana and the police officer walks by and doesn't do anything because society is saying, oh, leave him alone, doesn't take much admonition of that individual to change the behavior. You want to smoke your marijuana? Go into your own apartment. Don't be out annoying people on the street by kind of strutting your stuff and showing it off. Same for public drinking, the boorishness of that. So much of this behavior is just people, in a sense, acting out that, hey, look at me, I'm a free spirit, I'm above the law. Well, I'm sorry that society exists to establish norms of behavior, and those norms of behavior are not so onerous that all of us can't conform to it. Should any of us be authorized to spray paint graffiti on public premise? Should any of us be authorized to take up 3 seats in a subway by stretching out and sleeping? Should any of us be authorized to aggressively get into somebody's face and demand money of them? Should any of us be authorized to hang out in a street corner, obstruct traffic by basically ostensibly washing windows and then demanding money? I don't think so. And society has said that behavior is against the law, at least in the United States. I'm not familiar with your laws up here. But what we now use the police for is to enforce those laws. And that's why New York's a safer city.
Right. Well, you've obviously, really put in question the traditional notions of, you solve crime by only looking at the societal antecedents. So you're looking at the actual criminal.
See, I'm not about solving crime as much as I am about preventing crime, and that is the fundamental difference of policing in the United States and what we did in New York. For 25 years in America, police were expected only to respond to crime after the fact. Clearance rates, arrest rates. What we changed in New York, we re-engineered the police department from a reaction-oriented focus, measuring our success by how quickly we responded, to how much crime do we prevent. When I sit here and talk to you about the fact that this year there'll be 400,000 fewer victims of crime in New York than there were in 1990, that's the measurement of success I want.
Not arrests.
Rather than 400,000 more arrests. To me, arrests are an indication that we're not doing our job. If I have to make more arrests, it's a short-term goal to get the goal of reduced crime. But if my arrest rates keep going up year after year, I've got a problem, because then something is not happening in terms of reducing crime and reducing disorder.
By reducing crime, by going after things like quality of life crimes, do we run the risk on the other side of ignoring that there could be, in fact, social problems associated? For example, where do the homeless people go who are arrested?
What I think will occur is it'll allow for more appropriate focus on just that issue. In other words, that if I can reduce, I meaning the police, the fearfulness associated with some of the behavior of the homeless, then society can get through that static and focus on the reality that some of these people, you cannot do anything for them. They want to stay on the streets. That is their lifestyle, and that's what we've found. But others can, in fact, be encouraged to get into social service settings. And what I'm all about is literally restoring order to the streets, restoring civility, reducing fear. And I think that will then help society to deal with whether it's race, the economy, cities that are felt to be safer, businesses will locate there, brings more people in. Then there's more tax revenue to do the social service types of things that we'd like done. And one of the pressures on your government, same in America, was the idea that there's not enough money to keep people in mental institutions, so, well, let's put them into the neighborhoods and see what happens there.
Without worrying about the social costs that
Exactly.
go on. Now, you did also increase the size of the police force.
That was critical in New York City.
7,000 new policemen. That made a difference, just the physical mass that was available?
In New York City, that was an essential element. I had a lot of cops to work with in 3 separate police departments, which we eventually merged into one. We had a housing police for public housing, a transit police, and a city police. So we went from 31,000 to 38,000, and Mayor Giuliani is going to increase it now to 40,000 to support an anti-drug initiative that will take place next year. In some cities, more cops are essential. In New York City, more cops were essential. In Boston, where I was also police commissioner, more cops were essential. Because despite falling crime rates of great significance, the public still wanted police presence in sufficient numbers, but almost as importantly, more importantly, not just seeing the police, but seeing them do something. Mm-hmm. And that's my brand of community policing, was not just to put beat cops in the neighborhood to get to know people and get to be there, but also to deal with issues of concern to the neighborhood. And if that was aggressive begging, if that was kids hanging on the corner, public wanted to see the cops doing something. The subways, they didn't want to see cops standing around while hundreds of thousands of people evaded the fear. They wanted to see those police do something. And that's the difference between what I did and what my predecessors were doing in New York. They were putting into place a community policing program with all these extra cops, but the cops were in some respects like potted plants. They were there. They weren't doing anything.
Yeah, but you reorganized structurally the police department
completely
also.
re-engineered the department, because policing to react to crime versus policing to prevent crime, it's night and day. Mm-hmm. It is
What
night
kind
and
of
day.
changes did you have to make structurally?
Well, in New York City, New York was a special case because of fear of corruption. The police in New York City were more encumbered by restrictions than any other American city.
Right.
Uniformed police in New York City were not authorized to interrupt drug trafficking on corners because of fear of corruption. It was to be left to specialized, plainclothes, heavily supervised units. What it was intended to do was reduce the fear of corruption within the ranks. Actually, in the public mind, increased the sense that the police were corrupt, because you'd see these uniformed officers ride by or walk by and not interrupt that type of behavior. Mm-hmm. And if drug dealers thought they could get away with selling a little grass surreptitiously and the police didn't bother them, next thing when the crack cocaine explosion occurred, it became more open, and police were seemingly ineffective. What we changed was the authorization. I was politically authorized by a law and order mayor to authorize the police to go correct that behavior. And with 38,000 cops, you can imagine 38,000 who were marching in that direction, who now all of a sudden began enforcing the rules, mm-hmm. what the impact would be. And one of the reasons I'm quite comfortable saying the principal reason for the reduction in crime and disorder in New York was the police, was it happened so fast. You can't point to anything else. Prison incarceration rates, change in the age of people in the city, the economy. Those are all long-term issues. What happened in New York City to snap it from here to there so quickly was the police completely changing their operating philosophy.
Now, complaints of police harassment, I understand, also went up over this
period
of time.
They went up during this period of time.
How did you deal with that?
One, by pretty much saying to cops, look, you will do this, but you will do it according to the law. And if you make a mistake, we will correct you, retrain you. If you make an intentional mistake or an intentional act, we will discipline you and we'll fire you for the more serious ones. So what we had going on in New York, think of it, we had 38,000 cops, an increase of 7,000, now enforcing rules and regulations that had not been enforced in a population of 8 million people, with 32 million tourists and 3 million additional commuters every day coming into the city. In the peak year for civilian complaints, 1996, there were about 5,000 complaints made against 38,000 New York City police in a city that had a daytime population of 11 million people, in which the police were making 100,000 more arrests, 350,000 arrests, issuing 10 million parking summonses, issuing 4 million other citations to citizens. With all of that activity, and also the creation of a civilian complaint review board independent of the police that was advertising, come to us with your complaints. Mm-hmm. 5,000 complaints, of which a very small number were found to be substantiated. Was there an increase percentage-wise? Certainly, about 30%. But what was the payoff, if you will? A much safer city, and in retrospect, a department that had some people who shouldn't have been on the job, many of whom were fired, others who the department aggressively seeks to get rid of. the New York experience was one that you can have more effective policing without creating a police state.
Now, computers were also part. You had a system of
certainly.
ComStat. Tell us about that.
The engine that drove the crime reduction effort in New York City was based on 4 premises. Timely, accurate intelligence, the idea of spotting very quickly emerging trends and patterns. In a very large city, we developed computer systems to allow us to take a lot of information and spot those patterns and trends. Rapid response to that information. We spot within 3 or 4 days, we get a pattern of robberies, rapidly get resources in there to deal with that problem. Thirdly, effective tactics. What's going to work? Uniform, plain clothes, coordination between precincts. And fourthly, aggressive follow-up, constantly reviewing what works, what doesn't work. We developed the ComStat process, which is weekly meetings at police headquarters with several hundred police officials, all using the same information, exchanging information about crime, about quality of life issues, what works, what doesn't work, why isn't crime down, why is crime up, brainstorming sessions. And it was a completely different approach to policing than had gone on for 25 years in New York, where crime statistics were not used for the allocation of police resources. They were just used for statistical reporting purposes. A fundamental change.
Now, you touched on it earlier, just to kind of in passing, but the fact of the matter is that crime, while the story of New York is probably the most spectacular, crime is down everywhere. And that there are people, who are saying that, look, this is really a function of, you get the Brady gun law that comes in, you have a tremendous increase in incarceration of prison population, you have demographics. What's your response to that really this is just a function of societal change rather than change in police behavior?
In some respects, on a city-by-city basis, because what was working in New York was different than what was working in San Diego and what was working in Boston. And while the overall crime trend in the United States has been down for 5 years, in New York City it's been down for 8 years, there is some commonality to some of the things that are having longer-term impact. Prison incarceration rates, certainly. I really do believe that a lot of bad people are in jail and a lot of bad people commit a lot of crime. Demographics play a role in the sense that we know certain age categories traditionally commit more crime. We know that the economy sometimes may have a role to play. We know that race issues sometimes come into play, that we certainly have much more crime in our minority communities. That's a fact, that's a reality, but we also have many more victims in those communities. So those are longer-term trends. In New York City, none of that would have played that significant a role in the quick turnaround. Over the 8-year spread, has some of it helped, certainly. In New York City, we also had a lot more police to work with. So what you try to find is what works for your particular city, your particular province. And that's why I'm all about the sharing of ideas and information, that a lot of what occurred in New York was transferable, it's replicable, it's not cookie cutter. You take what you buy a car, you might like a lot of chrome in your car, somebody else wants an AM/FM stereo radio. Literally what we're talking about is designing a policing system that's suitable for your particular environment.
Well, let's talk with that, because I'm sure there are people in our audience who are saying, wow, that's New York. New York's a jungle, and New Yorkers are animals.
Right.
This is Toronto the good.
Right.
Even with the tremendous decrease in things like homicide rates, it's still 6 times higher on a per capita basis in New York than Toronto. This really doesn't apply to Toronto, would be their response.
It would, much of it would, in the sense that the policing systems we use, the computer systems, the exchange of information, the management of the police department, accountability down to the precinct level or whatever you have here, districts I'm assuming is probably what you have here. These are management systems that can be applied anywhere. And as to how you want to apply them, for what purpose, crime, disorder, fear reduction, implementation of more effective community policing, it has relevance. Certainly there's differences between the society in your country and the society in my country. The violence level is phenomenal in my country because of firearms. You have nowhere near the gun situation. England has recently banned all firearms, which is a great move. But the reality in my country is you could never do that. So you have to work within the environment that, in the culture. Similarly here. And the benefit you have is, while there are some parallels between our 2 respective countries, take a look at where we went wrong to ensure that you're not going down the same course.
Well, that's the other side of it, because we do have squeegee kids. We do have, aggressive begging. in Toronto. We have people who walk down the street smoking pot. I mean, could those behaviors lead to the kind of New York that we saw at the start
I
of
do
the
believe
decade?
that is the case. If you do not deter that, if you look the other way, or you dismiss it that we need to be working on more serious crime, we started small. I came into policing in 1970 in America, and I watched that deterioration occur. And I was privileged to become a leader at the other end of my career to move American policing in another direction, and I think a more effective direction.
Can you make the changes that you've made about criminal behavior without making changes to the underlying societal problems?
Oh, sure, because what we're talking about is behavior, not the condition, behavior. We've always had homeless. We've always had youth unemployment. I can remember as a kid, 15, 16 years old, I couldn't get a job. But did I go out begging? Did I go out aggressively antagonizing my neighborhoods? No, because why? My behavior was controlled by my family, by the police, by the neighborhood. So this issue that because they don't have jobs or that because they're homeless, that we should somehow or another let them slide, that, well, what's the harm? Sorry, I don't buy it. I've seen the long-term impact of that in America, in Boston, in New York, and you don't want to see it here.